friend who plans to spend his gap year on a journey of self-discovery, and he often jokes that he came back early because he didn't like what he found. We often describe Lent as a journey, and of course it has an endpoint in Easter, but there's another sense in which it's a journey too. In our culture, a journey is often about finding ourselves, but the Christian journey is about finding Christ. And it's only when we find Christ that we finally discover who we really are. So this Lenten journey began 2 weeks ago when the church presented us with the story of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. The question we were asked was, where do you put your trust? In the world's false promises or in God? And then last week, we stood on the mountain of the Transfiguration and heard the Father say, "This is my beloved Son." Before anything is accomplished by the Lord, before success, before failure, identity comes first. And it's given as a gift. In our baptism, we have already received an identity as sons and daughters of God, independent of our being, good or bad. So we move from the desert to the mountain, and today the scene changes again. This time, we find ourselves beside the well, and the question we're asked is a profound one. Deep down, what are you really thirsty for? At first glance, it might not seem unusual that Jesus meets a woman drawing water, but the Gospel tells us something important. She is a Samaritan woman. In other words, Jesus has got to a place where most Jews would not think of going. This isn't a casual encounter, and the Gospel tells us something else. It's midday, 6th hour, which is odd, because people usually collected water when it was cool, early in the morning or later in the evening. And so they meet in the heat of the day. And at first the conversation seems ordinary. Jesus asks her for a drink. She's surprised. How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? But this story isn't really about water. It's about thirst. So Jesus says, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give will never be thirsty again. Someone once told me that when people are stranded at sea, the great temptation is to drink seawater. For a moment, it feels like relief. But the seawater actually makes the thirst worse. The more you drink, the more dehydrated you become. Sometimes the human heart works in a similar way. We search for satisfaction in things that promise relief, but they leave us more restless than before. People return again and again to the same well. Success, relationships, stimulation, approval, distraction, control. We drink, and yet the thirst, craving returns. The problem isn't that we thirst. The problem is where we try to satisfy it. And so Jesus, who has sought this woman out, begins to lead her on a journey. At the beginning, he's simply a stranger sitting at the well, a Jewish traveller asking a fiercely Samaritan woman for water. But as they speak, something about the conversation captures her curiosity. And she begins to desire what Jesus offers. "Sir," she says, "give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." And then Jesus reveals that he knows the truth about her life. She says, "I have no husband." And Jesus, with humor, replies, "You're right to say that, because you had 5 husbands, and the one that you've got now isn't your husband." And suddenly, she begins to recognize something more. "Sir, I see that you are a prophet." The conversation continues, and she begins to thirst for something different. She says, I know that the Messiah is coming. The Messiah is the one promised by God, the one for whom all the people, Samaritan and Jew, long. And Jesus replies, I am he. The person she thought was a stranger turns out to be the one for whom she had been longing all along. And once she makes that discovery, she can't keep it to herself. She came for water, but she leaves with a mission. She runs back to town and tells everyone. And many Samaritans from that town, were told, believed in him because of that woman's testimony. And when they meet Jesus themselves, they say something even greater. It's no longer because of what you said that we believe. We have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Saviour of the world. The woman arrived at the well alone, avoiding people because of her bad reputation, becomes the first person to bring her whole village to Christ. Despite her brokenness, she becomes the first evangelizer. And perhaps she's effective precisely because of it. And that's why we put such emphasis on invitation and evangelization, on welcome and hospitality in our parish. Because the whole gospel is a journey of recognition. The stranger becomes the prophet, recognized as the Messiah, and is worshipped as the Saviour. That's how faith often grows, gradually, through encounter and acceptance and discovery. And then there's one final detail in the story that's so tiny we could miss it, and yet I think it's really important. When the woman realizes who Jesus is, the Gospel tells us she leaves her water jar behind and runs back to the town. The jar that she came to fill is suddenly forgotten because she's discovered something better. And that's why the church brings us this gospel in Lent. Last week, we were reminded that we are beloved. Today, we're invited to ask the more searching question. If we are beloved, why do we still look for life in places that cannot satisfy us? Beneath our anxieties, our ambitions, our distractions, there's often a deeper thirst, the thirst for God. As St. Augustine famously said, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. The modern world tells us that we must construct our identity. We must build ourselves, curate ourselves, and reinvent ourselves. But the gospel offers something different. You don't have to invent yourself. You have to rediscover who you are, that you're already known, already loved, already called. And that from that place of longing, Christ offers something extraordinary. Not just advice, not just moral improvement, but living water. The grace of God that can actually satisfy the deepest thirst of the human heart. And so the Lenten journey continues. The desert, we learn to trust. On the mountain, we remember who we are. Say at the well, we begin to recognize what we really thirst for. And when that thirst finally brings us to Christ, something begins to change. The world we once depended on loses their power. Like the Samaritan woman, we can leave the jar behind because we begin to discover a new freedom. The freedom that comes from the deepest thirst of the human heart finally finds its source. Next week, we'll hear about a man who was born blind. Because when Christ begins to satisfy our thirst, the next gift that he gives is sight. Father, for the Son, and for the Spirit.